Right. Today we're going to speak directly to one of the fundamental premises related to our discussion about Adam Smith's invisible hand. And the example that occurs to me, how many of you have seen the movie Pretty Woman? Everybody's seen it, right? No, not everyone, most everyone. There is a scene in this movie where Richard Gere decides he wants to spend the next week with Julia Roberts. And he walks into the bathroom and she is bathing in suds. There's no nudity in this particular scene. But they begin to bargain about his request for her being available for the next week at his beck and call. And they negotiate for a while and reach a conclusion that he, Gere, will pay her $3,000 for being available to him, on a moment's notice for the course of 7 days. Pardon? She what? Well, that's during the week. They didn't negotiate about the clothes at the time, but you're quite right. And by the way, when she went into the store to get the clothes, she wasn't appreciated either. Yeah, exactly. So after they finish the bargaining process, they reach a conclusion of $3,000. And she, in great delight, looks at him and says, I was prepared to do it for $2,000. And he looked back at her and said, so I was prepared to pay $4,000. All right? So today's fundamental concept, what's the gain to him and what's the gain to her? When she represented that she was willing to do it for $2,000, presumably her opportunity cost was $2,000. But she negotiated $3,000. So her net benefit is $1,000, right? $3,000 less $2,000. What about him? His willingness to pay was $4,000, but he negotiated a price of $3,000. So he too has a net gain of $1,000. So in terms of the total benefit of this transaction, and there are lots of ways of measuring this, I suppose, but at least monetarily, the total benefit is $2,000, right? $1,000 accrues to him and $1,000 accrues to her. Now, that simple transaction, we're going to look at much more complicated versions of that, but at the end of the day, all it is what is a buyer's willingness to pay versus a seller's willingness to sell. And we're comparing what is their willingness to sell versus the price that they end up having to pay, and or the price that, if they're a seller, they're able to receive. Okay? Okay, so what are we going to be looking at today? What is consumer surplus? In the example of Pretty Woman, the consumer surplus for Richard Gere is $1,000. And then how is that related to the demand curve that we've been discussing for the last few lectures? What is producer surplus? How is it related to the supply curve? And that is Julia Roberts' actual willingness to sell. And do the markets end up generating a desirable allocation of resources? Could we improve upon the market outcome where the market outcome is the equilibrium? Right? Those are the questions we want to analyze. This is defined in economics as welfare economics. And what we're trying to do is assess the well-being of different buyers and sellers in the marketplace. Right? Okay. Recall that when we spoke about the fundamental definition of economics is how do we determine the allocation of scarce resources and how much of a good is produced, who will produce that good, which consumers will end up consuming the good, and welfare economics studies the allocation of resources and how it affects economic well-being. All right? And first we'll dig deeply on the buy side looking at consumers, and then we'll turn to sellers and look at the production side. Okay. Willingness to pay. A buyer's willingness to pay for a good is the maximum amount that the buyer will pay for that good. Coming back to our description of Pretty Woman, suppose that his willingness to pay was $1,500. Would there have been a transaction? Unless she falsely represented what her opportunity cost of time was, right? But no, there shouldn't be a transaction. So the willingness to pay measures how much the buyer values the good. Let's look at a concrete example. We have here 4 potential buyers. The maximum willingness to pay by Anthony is $250, and you see the other 4 individuals with respect to their willingness to pay. We have $175 for one of the potential buyers, $300 for another, and $125. Now, we can take that information and construct a demand curve. And let's look at a case in which they're buying iPods. These are their willingness to pay for iPods. And let's suppose the price of the iPod is $200. The question is who will buy the iPod and what is the total quantity demanded? 2 of these potential buyers will enter into transactions to buy the iPod and 2 will not. And as a result, the total quantity moving through the market for just these 4 buyers will be 2 when the price is $200. Okay? Now we can proceed to construct the demand curve. And here all we're doing is looking at what happens if the market price is $301 or above. What happens? Does anybody buy? No. So for this first case, there should be no one buying. And as a result, the quantity demanded at that price is going to be 0. Right? What about the second range, 251 to 300? Any buyers here? Who? Okay, Flea steps forward because Flea's willingness to pay is 300. And as a result, there's one iPod that's sold in this market. 176 to 250. Now we have 2 buyers. What happens from 126 to 175? 3. And the third one that enters the market now is? Okay, quite right. 3. And then finally, if Apple decides they want to move a large volume, they lower the price, and we end up with all 4 facing a price that's below all of their respective willingnesses to pay. Right? So that's our demand curve. We can construct now a curve off of this schedule, and then going through that process as we've done before, looking first for prices above 300, there is no demand. The quantity demand is 0 for all those prices. As soon as it gets to 300, then we have a buyer who steps forward. As the prices fall to 250, it turns out that we end up with another buyer, and so on. Continuing, this is not the usual demand function that we've looked at up to this point in time. Usually the demand functions are very smooth, right? And the reason they're not smooth here is because there are only 4 buyers. And by the way, with respect to our definition of a competitive marketplace, would you only have 4 buyers? Pardon? Get familiar with this. Jim, what do you say?
4 sellers or 4 buyers?
What are we talking about here?
The question was,
did I say sellers? Okay.
So there's more than 4 buyers.
Right. No, that's not what I said. Let me see if we can restate this. In a competitive marketplace, what is the underlying assumptions about a competitive marketplace? Is it a marketplace where there are only 4 buyers, or 2 buyers, or 5 buyers? Yes, exactly. There are thousands of buyers. So even though this is a step function, if we went through the same process, eliciting the willingness to pay on the part of thousands of buyers, this stair-step function would suddenly become very smooth, right? Okay, so that's the point. And if there's a huge number of buyers, as in a competitive market, we would expect very tiny steps. And ultimately, it would become, as the number of buyers increase, it would become a smooth curve. Okay? All right. Now, the willingness to pay. Where is the information about the willingness to pay on this demand curve? Recall that we constructed the demand curve by going back and looking at the willingness to pay on the part of each and every one of these 4 consumers. So if I gave you a demand curve instead of constructing it from the willingness to pay, how could you infer what the willingness to pay is off of this curve? What would you do? Paul, what would you do?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. If I gave you this curve and I said, how can you determine the willingness to pay off of this curve?
I would compare the subtract. I would compare the steps that I would take from like 150 to 200.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would. That's all I would do.
That's all you would do?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody want to help Paul? Yes.
What is the height of the demand curve that I get?
Right. And that would tell you somebody's willingness to pay because that demand curve is constructed off of the maximum willingness to pay of each and every buyer that is reflected on that curve, right? So at any Q, the height of the demand curve is the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer at that quantity, right? Okay. And why we call that buyer the marginal buyer? Because if the price were any higher, that buyer would leave the market. Leave the market in the sense that they wouldn't enter into a transaction, right? Okay. That's why we call that particular buyer the marginal buyer. And each one of these stair steps represents the willingness to pay of each of the 4 buyers for iPods that we used, or we took that data to construct this demand curve. Okay, consumer surplus. We got the willingness to pay. Now the question is, how do we construct consumer surplus? Coming back to the simple example of the negotiations or bargaining that takes place between Gear and Roberts, there, the consumer surplus, I presume we all recognize, it appears as though everybody recognized that the consumer surplus for Gear was the $4,000 he was willing to pay versus what he had to pay, $3,000. The difference is his surplus, right? Make sense? All right. So formally, it's the amount the buyer is willing to pay minus the amount that the buyer has to actually pay. Right? And simply in equation form, it's the willingness to pay less whatever actual price the buyer must pay. Now coming back to our simple example of these 4 buyers in the iPod market, suppose P, the P is $260. And let's ask ourselves, what is the consumer surplus? First of all, we've already noted that for a price of $260, there is only one buyer that's going to consummate a transaction, right? Because that price would be above all the other 3 potential buyers above their willingness to pay, right? Okay, so the consumer surplus for this one buyer is that person's willingness to pay, which is $300 here, less the price that is being asked by Apple of $260, and thus that person's consumer surplus is $40. Right? No one else in this market gets any consumer surplus because they don't complete a transaction. Right? And the total consumer surplus is $40. Now, if the price, we'll look at this in a moment, just going back to the schedule, the curve itself, here is the willingness to pay, the computation of the $40, and note that it's nothing more than a rectangle. And it is the area above the price and below the demand curve. Okay? Now let's suppose that the price falls to $220. Now what happens with regard to consumer surplus? There's going to be more than a single transaction. And moreover, the person with the highest willingness to pay of $300 is now going to have a larger consumer surplus, right? Because they're going to purchase the same quantity that they did when the price was much higher, but now their gain, their net benefit, or their consumer surplus, it's going to be larger because their willingness to pay remains the same, but the price has fallen. So all I've represented here is the new rectangle area for the buyer with the highest willingness to pay. But now we've got a second buyer as well. Anthony steps forward, and he purchases an iPod, and his willingness to pay is $250. He only has to pay a price of $220, so he's a winner. He gets a consumer surplus of $30. And there's nothing here about equity. It may not seem fair to you that Anthony is only capturing $30 of surplus when Clea is capturing $80. But that's really nothing more than a function of their willingness to pay. Right? Yes?
Is what you're describing the consumer surplus in reality is a sale, because it doesn't seem to have any grounding in hard cash. People have any sort of surplus. It's only their expectation. That would be what you would call a sale.
You say it's not concrete. What was the phrase that you used?
Grounded in cash.
Grounded in cash. It's a monetary value, and certainly what they pay for the good is grounded in cash. That is grounded in cash. You certainly can't determine what the consumer surplus is without knowing the person's willingness to pay. That's certainly true. But that willingness to pay is monetized in cash as well. So I think the right interpretation is both the price with regard to a transaction that's consummated and the willingness to pay has a monetary value. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense to compute a consumer surplus and put a monetary value on that. Later in the course, we'll look at instances where you can actually elicit people's willingness to pay. It is not, as I think is the motivation for your question, it is not a transaction. It is somebody's inherent value for some good that they desire. And if the price of the good is above their inherent value, they're not going to engage in any transaction for that good. Otherwise, they'd be irrational. What? Okay, good. Okay. So now the total consumer surplus, because we've got two buyers completing transactions, one gets 80 in surplus, another gets 30, so the total is 110. What's the lesson? As I've noted, the lesson is that you can compute the consumer surplus as the area under the demand curve above the price out to the quantity that moves through the market. By the way, you can't have any consumer surplus unless there's actual flow of goods or services, right? So it's got to be based on the quantity that moves through the market. Now, if we have lots of buyers and sellers, and let's look at a concrete example where we're examining the demand for shoes. On the horizontal axis, we have quantity, which is thousands of pairs of shoes that are moving through the marketplace, and this is the price per pair on the vertical axis. Now, we have a smooth curve, and how do we generalize what we've already done with regard to just 4 buyers when we have thousands of buyers for these shoes? Right? And let's look first at 5,000 shoes moving through this market, and we come up to the demand curve, and the demand curve tells us what the marginal buyer's willingness to pay is. And if we come up for the 5,000 units up the demand curve, this is the willingness to pay for that quantity, and that willingness to pay is $50 for a pair of shoes. Suppose now that the actual price for these pairs of shoes is $30. The marginal consumer at the last unit of a pair of shoes being sold, that is going to be an amount of $50 being the willingness to pay on the part of that marginal buyer, and that marginal buyer only has to pay $30, right? So that marginal buyer picks up $20 of surplus. And if we continue looking at each marginal buyer at different quantities along the demand curve, right, we'll end up with the total consumer surplus at the quantity of 15,000 units, and we're looking at everything above the price up to the demand curve, and that is nothing more than a triangle. And recall that a triangle is measured as 1/2 times the base times the height, and if we take the data that's here, the height is $60 at the top of that triangle down to 30 for the quantity of 15,000 units moving through the market, and going on and computing the area above the price and below the demand curve, that is consumer surplus, and for this specific example, that would be $225. So if I give you a demand curve and I give you a price, you should be able to compute the consumer surplus straight away, right? That's all you need to know to compute the consumer surplus. Now, what happens as prices rise? Your textbook looks at the opposite case. It looks at what happens as prices fall. How does that affect consumer surplus? We'll move in the opposite direction. And let's suppose that the price moves upward to $40. Now the total consumer surplus decreases to $100. And there's 2 reasons for this fall in consumer surplus. One reason is that some buyers are now going to leave the market. When I say leave the market, I mean they're not going to consummate a transaction. Why? Because price is now higher than some of those buyers' willingness to pay. Okay? In addition, a second reason is those who formerly bought before the price rise, who still buy after the price rise, now have less consumer surplus, even though they're still engaged in transactions. Right? Now, let me make what I just said concrete. This first triangle here, the hash triangle, is the fall in consumer surplus due to buyers leaving the market. Right? Okay? And the second decrease is the blue rectangle here that I've shaded in green now. That's the fall in consumer surplus due to the remaining buyers paying a higher price. Quite obviously, intuitively, they can't have as much consumer surplus, right? Even though they're consummating transactions, they're paying a higher price, and thus the gap between their willingness to pay and what was formerly the price, given the new price, is now smaller. Okay? All right, let's take a concrete example, one of our active learning examples. I want you to find the marginal buyer's willingness to pay at a quantity of 10, and find the consumer surplus for a price of $30. And then suppose the price falls to $20. How much will consumer surplus increase due to, 1, now instead of buyers leaving the market, you've got buyers entering the market, and 2, the existing buyers paying a lower price? You can visit with your neighbors, take a few moments, see if you can sort out what the answer to each of these questions are. Six. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7, 8. Just give me 1 second. That's 9, 8, 9, 8, 7. There's an Andy Wong that's sitting in that seat. What? Just this time. Certainly. Pardon?